All right, I think we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you joined us today. My name is Terry Murphy, and I'm the Associate Director for Peacebuilding Research at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies. Our work spans global, national, and deeply human dimensions of conflict and peace, and it's wonderful to see such a strong interest in today's conversation. The Measuring Peace series explores the many ways that scholars and policymakers and practitioners think about peace, what we mean when we use that word, what we hope to understand about it, and how we go about building knowledge on the subject. The series is intentionally interdisciplinary, and we draw on a range of theoretical frameworks, methods, research traditions, and geographic contexts. Our approach is multiscalar. We look at peace through elite, national, subnational, regional, local, and even hyperlocal dynamics, especially in those places that have experienced or are currently experiencing violent conflict. The series is meant to serve as a shared learning space, a place where we can exchange ideas, encounter new and different perspectives, and spend time with this elusive concept of peace so that we can better understand what it takes to make it real in people's lives. A few weeks ago, Mershon launched a new project titled From Violent Conflict to Criminality. And throughout this year, the Measuring Peace series will feature members of that research team as they share their own work that they're conducting alongside this project. The project itself is led by Dr. Roddy Brett, who recently spent time with us here at OSU and whom I'll introduce more fully in just a moment. He will be our moderator today. But today we have the pleasure of learning from Clara Voyvodic. I told you, Clara, I was going to do this, who will share her work on rebel governance while also making connections to several themes related to measuring peace, such as what does it mean to assess peace in the aftermath of peace agreements when violence and criminality persist? Might the design of peace agreements influence post-accord criminality and violence? Which interdisciplinary research methodologies are most generative for studying post-accord criminality and violence? Our format today includes about a 45-minute presentation, followed by a discussion between Roddy and Clara, and then there'll be time for your questions. So please feel free to add your questions to the chat at any point. I'll keep an eye on them, and then I'll weave them together toward the end. Before we begin, it's my sincere pleasure to introduce Dr. Roddy Brett, a scholar and a practitioner whose career has been devoted to understanding and helping transform some of the most challenging experiences of violence and conflict around the world. Roddy's work spans more than 2 decades and brings together anthropology, political science, peace building, and international relations. He's devoted his career to studying armed conflict, political violence, and genocide, as well as the long-term legacies they leave behind. Equally important, he works on the strategies that support societal healing, such as transitional justice, peace building, and efforts to rebuild communities and strengthen resilience. Across all of these roles, Roddy brings an uncommon blend of rigor, humility, compassion, and commitment. He is someone who not only studies how violence takes shape, but who dedicates himself to helping societies move beyond it. And it's been a real pleasure to get to know him, and I consider him a mate. Thanks, Roddy, and we appreciate you moderating today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Terry, thanks very much for such kind words. It's great to be here, wherever here is, in this space with all of you, and back, of course, with colleagues from the Mershon and from the Ohio State University. So thanks to the Measuring Peace series. It's really great to be back aboard this. I'm just going to speak really briefly about our project that we've just kicked off with the support of the Mershon, and then really hand over to Clara. It's Clara's gig today, so it's going to be very exciting to hear about Clara's work. As Terry has mentioned, we've just really begun a new project supported very kindly by the Mershon Center. And we're really excited about this because it brings together folks from a whole range of different institutions, including universities and NGOs. We've got some great people from the Mershon and from the Ohio State yourselves. And the project really is focused on the trajectory from the trajectory from political violence to criminality. So what we're trying to understand is when we look at contexts of armed conflict, civil war, genocide, how there's a shift very often when a conflict ends formally towards criminality. But of course, the point is we all know that that dichotomy isn't quite as stark as we think it might be. Armed groups are already carrying out very often criminal violence during conflict, and criminal organizations are very often linked very profoundly to political violence and political activities in the wake of a conflict. So we're pretty clear as an opening gambit that that dichotomy isn't entirely helpful, and the case studies we'll be working on, so Colombia, Northern Ireland, and Ecuador, different though they are, really demonstrate those nuances and those complexities. So we're working across 3 different cases, but we also, and I think very significantly, have 4 really interesting cross-cutting themes that we're applying to looking at political violence and criminality as a sort of nexus in these particular cases. So in other words, we're looking at agenda focus, we're applying agenda focus, we're looking at the question of legitimacy across these three cases. We're really focusing on peace building, so the DDR security sector reform nexus within those contexts, but also we're looking at extraterritoriality. So we think those are really innovative elements. We really want very much that this project creates and generates new academic scholarship and knowledge, but also keys into policy and practice. And of course, the Mershon and Terry very much individually are brilliant at bringing together these 2 sadly kind of dichotomous spheres of policy practice on the one hand and academia on the other. So Clara's not going to talk about this project. Clara is one of the co-Is. I'm PIing the project. Clara is one of the fantastic co-Is that we have. So she will probably infer some of the elements that, because we haven't done the research yet, so she'll probably infer some of the questions, and we'll come back to that, I suspect, later on. So it's a massive delight to introduce Clara Voyvodic, who is going to speak on rebel governance and politics of access. So I know Clara very well by now. We've worked together in different capacities. At present, she is a lecturer at the University of Bradford in peace and conflict studies, I think. Pretty much. You'll tell us if I suspect I didn't get that entirely right. Prior to that, she was with me at the University of Bristol doing some fantastic work as senior research fellow, working on a project comparing post-Accord everyday lives in Lebanon, Northern Ireland, and Colombia. So she brings together some really strong empirical data as well as a very strong conceptual and theoretical knowledge. She was also heading up one of our research groups here at the University of Bristol, the Peace, Conflict and Violence Research Group. She holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Oxford, and she's done all sorts of really fantastic work in the humanitarian sector, in the security sector, having roles in human rights protection, anti-corruption, monitoring, fugitive investigation. So really interesting to bring this to bear, this experiential knowledge to bear. At the moment, I believe you're a fellow in the Centre for Armed Groups based in Geneva and a fellow at the Civil Wars Pathways program at the University of York. And you published very broadly. So we're really excited to hear your research today. I think you're going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. So I'll hand it over to you, and then we'll, I think, open up for Q&A. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from the audience. So great to be here. Really looking forward to this. Clara, the floor's yours.
Thank you. Also very kind words. So thank you for the introduction and all accurate. So nothing to correct. I'm going to briefly share. I'm going to share my screen now. So hopefully that should go well. Okay. So hopefully that means you can now see my screen. Please do stop me if you can't. So as Roddy said, I'm going to be talking today sort of orthogonally to some of the questions that were posed. I'll be discussing some of my own research and some new ideas that have been under discussion with some colleagues of mine. and kind of how we're approaching it. I'm going to put forward some of the thinking we've been doing around that, but it will, I will also be discussing a little bit about how it connects to the Measuring Peace initiative and the project that Roddy was discussing. But I'm very happy for it to be part of a broader discussion as well at the end, and I look forward to everyone's thoughts about how these things also intersect. So today, I'm going to be discussing what we're terming the politics of access, and basically the relationship of rebel governance, civilian participation to peace building more broadly. So the first thing I'd like to do is discuss a little bit the background of this and how I'd like to approach today's presentation. So the main thrust of this is going to be to unpack the implications, the variation, and the legacy of civilian participation in rebel governance, and what that means for peace building, particularly after transitions, demobilizations, or peace accords. We understand that the civilians or the community are rarely homogenous, so this is going to be a crucial element that we'll discuss. But neither are their sort of relationships, their participation, and their expectation of rebel authorities in these spaces. So briefly today, what I'd like to do is I'd first like to overview my research on the legacy of rebel governance, the notion of relational security, and sort of how this drives civilian expectations, particularly in transition periods. I'd also like to then talk about the concepts of gatekeepers and conflict, and what are the roles of civilians in negotiating access of external actors, particularly in the development, humanitarian, and peace sectors, and what that means. And then finally, I'd like to introduce and discuss in a little bit more detail this new project that I'm working on with colleagues in a couple of different institutions, and sort of present a typology of civilian participation in rebel governance that we think is sort of a crucial unpacking of how much variety and variation there is between sort of rebel groups and their ways of controlling territory and the relationship with civilians, and also what this actually may mean in terms of peace building and in terms of the access and relationships with external actors. As mentioned, this research is largely based on about 6 years of researching on conflict, on rebel governance and post-accord dynamics in Colombia, as well as in Northern Ireland, as Roddy mentioned with the project. And in particular, most of this work is derived from my research during my DPhil at the University of Oxford, and the Getting On With It project at the University of Bristol that Roddy discussed already. So the first question is sort of just thinking more broadly about the legacy of rebel order and what this means in terms of transition periods. So there's a growing research on the legacies of rebel governance, and in terms particularly around rebel political participation. So, when the aftermath of a conflict, what do rebel groups do? What is their role in the aftermath? How does this concept of rebel governance actually shift into being political actors? In many cases, rebel organizations may turn into political parties, or they may seek some sort of leadership position. So, their role as governance actors during the conflict, in which they may provide some degree of localized authority, public service provision, justice, etc., somehow may be translated into a more national level role. So the focus of this research tends towards the national level politics and institutions. But as sort of Grajales and Levy discuss when they're looking at the transition period of the paramilitary organizations in Colombia, it's actually probably still necessary to look beyond that national politics and understand how this impacts at the micro level or the local environment. So this is also the kind of perhaps controversial concept that a lot of peace buildings, at least very much its impact, is local. So regardless of sort of the will or objective of international and national actors, the sense of authority and where decisions can be made about how peace building projects may come forward are usually tied to the spaces in which those projects are being enacted. So the idea behind this presentation is to think in those spaces at that micro level, what are the relationships and dynamics between civilians and armed actors, and how does that shape the peace building efforts, as well as the relationships with those who come in to support or enable development and peace building efforts. So the first thing is that this is obviously about a transition, which means that between the past and the present, a period of a peace accord or demobilization means a sort of a rupture or a transformation of some kind of social ordering at the local level. First, there's a paper I wrote and published a few years ago, which looks at the legacy of rebel order, specifically at the aftermath of the Colombian Peace Accord in 2016. So this research comes out of the idea that as I was doing some field work for my PhD, there was a lot about civilians' expectations or responses to their sort of new circumstances and under the FARC's demobilization that had a lot to do with how they had experienced and engaged with the FARC's governance previous to the demobilization. So what I came up with is this idea that civilian expectations of their security in particular are shaped by not just their experiences of pre-accord non-state authority, in this case, that of the FARC, but also about the context in which they find themselves in the post-accord space, which in the case of Colombia, and in particular in areas where the FARC demobilized and withdrew from the territory, was characterized by a significant amount of uncertainty. So here, for example, we have already the sense that the constant assessment of current types of authority or peace efforts are sort of measured against the sense of security provided in the past. So one local leader explains that if one commander had committed an assassination without an order, they were punished or executed. Our worry with them leaving is who is going to be left here. The FARC, at least, in this case, had a structure and a capacity to control. So there's already a sense in which the experience of conflict may not only be characterized by a sense of violence or disorder, but actually one of structure and authority. But this doesn't mean, and this will be sort of a running theme as well throughout all of this, that these sort of authority figures or these sort of non-state authorities are necessarily always legitimate or positively perceived. In fact, much of this I discuss in that paper is the negotiation of the dual legacies. So there's a sense that both rebels or source of order, but also violence and insecurity. And so there's actually quite a complex assessment that's being made there. And generally find that civilians are actually quite reflective and pragmatic about the reality of armed actors and their function under less than ideal circumstances. In which in another forthcoming or under construction paper is the idea that these actors are generally realistically portrayed as flawed authorities operating in a complex system. But that's to say that this is actually a lot about how people experience and remember the past and what that brings, what the sort of that engagement they had, what they bring with them into the peace building space. So I discuss this in terms of relational security indicators, which I base on Roger McGinty's idea of everyday peace indicators, in that it is a highly subjective, highly localized way of assessing how civilians may actually consider their own security in relation to what they perceive as the sort of standard, often set in the past. So in this case, how do they experience non-state order or rebel governance during conflict help them assess or guide their assessment of new authorities' capacity to provide security? And I briefly sort of outline 4 key factors. This is the ideas under protection of shielding, which is against other hostile armed groups, and social regulation, which is the provision of internal adjudication or enforcement. So if crimes are committed or transgression committed by members of the civilian population against other members of the civilian population, that the authority figure steps in to help minimize that insecurity. But it's also about the structure of the organization itself and implicitly about the relationship and engagement that civilians had with that structure. So what came out of this work, which was a really sort of which is a really grounded approach, coming from what people were saying and what the kind of sense at the time was that it's largely about the accountability. So as mentioned with that of the FARC commander, so the internal redress for transgressions by combatants against civilians. So if a combatant were to step out of line, there would be a sense that would be taken into account and that would be rectified by the commander. But also attribution, in which there was a sort of visibility and clarity around command structure and a communication, sort of a clear and visible communication with the civilian population, so that civilians knew where to go and who was the person to go to when there was issues or problems to resolve. And so that's quite a crucial element, because it's not just about how does the armed group act, but it's actually what is the relationship to the civilian population. And that is carried with a lot of civilian populations after the withdrawal of the group. In particular, in a context like Colombia, which in its aftermath of the 2016 peace accord did not become, it remained complex in its security landscape. So in this case, in a paper I published recently with Jose Gutierrez, there was the idea that these same civilian expectations also can drive patterns of remobilization and new types of non-state armed authorities. And so there's this idea that other groups that attempt to take up these spaces and to sort of take control of these territories, largely driven, in the case of Colombia, by a degree of interest in the illicit economies, but not uniquely, is very much dictated in a way, or the relationship with the community is then very much dictated by the sort of previous structures of rebel governance. So here, there's this idea that there's norms of coexistence. So the different leaders in Putumayo were discussing the idea that these new groups, these sort of dissident FARC groups, were coming in to organize a meeting, but they would find the meetings as if they were authority. So they were changing the norms of coexistence that had been established with the previous FARC organization in the territory. So they were using, as it were, the same manual, the same structure, but they were changing the rules. And this was something that was seen as a sort of failing at building appropriate types of relationship with the community. There's also this sense that these sort of new combatants or groups that were coming in didn't have the discipline. So again, the sort of attribution or accountability structures as previous groups. They didn't have the same discipline and ideology. And so there mentioned that all of these groups, there were too many young guys that didn't know how to control themselves, didn't know how to act in public. So interestingly enough, here, the local leader in Cauca was saying that, when some of these younger combatants started misbehaving, the leaders put in a complaint to the commander to say this was not acceptable. So we see this kind of reoccurring legacy of the FARC structure in the sort of establishment of these, remobilized or dissident groups that are emerging after the signing of the peace accord, that are very much using a very similar playbook to their predecessors, but also very much dictated and in relationship to the participation of civilians in these areas. So there is a sense here that one of the key metrics for peace is whether a population has a predictable, accessible, and then to some degree legitimate institution to meet their basic needs and resolve disputes, sort of regardless of who runs them. So there is a sense here in which we have to understand that some of the re-emergence or sort of consolidation of non-state armed authorities, even after the signing of a peace accord, may be driven by demand. As I mentioned, that these authorities are not necessarily always sort of political. So rebel governance is generally driven by the concept of an insurgent ideology. But obviously in Colombia in particular, there are many criminal organizations that have descended from paramilitary structures, and at this point now also rebel structures. But they have adapted more guerrilla and like FARC-like governance structures in how they engage with civilians. So in another piece of research I was doing, looking at, and I'll mention this in a little bit, but politics of access, it's notable that there is a sort of similar relationship that was emerging in an area in Nariño that I was working on between neo-paramilitary groups, so the successors of a paramilitary organization, with the sort of local community councils, as the councils had with the guerrillas. So some went with the guerrillas and some with the paramilitaries. So in this case, we see that there is a kind of replicated structure. This is learned behavior to an extent, but it's also about how communities are used to participating and engaging with rebel governance in these contexts, and that helps drive a little bit of those relationships. In this particular case, that relationship and knowing that that relationship existed between the armed structures, in this case, again, the sort of newly formed criminal armed structures and the local community was really important in carrying out some projects that were being done in the area, particularly around road provision, which was considered to be an important initiative taken by the departmental government in order to help these communities access new market structures and to help move away from conflict. So in this case, the engineer is very clear that understanding these engagements, these sort of the civilian participation in these two different structures was really crucial to understand how they could work. So they would communicate specifically to local leaders, and that those leaders would then advise them. They acknowledged that with some commanders it was more difficult than others, but there was no trouble in working because fundamentally they recognized that the armed groups would not oppose the projects they were putting forward because they would also benefit, and because it was good for the relationship with the community. So we see that both the sort of rebel and even criminal style governance to the benefit both in civilian participation, but in using that in terms of what that means for the access of these development actors in the territory. So I want to then now move on a little bit more to then what this means for the concept of sort of gatekeepers and politics of access. So as I mentioned, this relationship with civilians is crucial to shaping the role of rebel actors as gatekeepers within territories. So armed groups often act as like the localized authorities that can dictate the entry or demand the exit of national and international development actors, which are considered outsiders to the territory. And mentioned in another project, in another piece of research, that actually in many cases the sense of spatial localization of these territories and the extent of the rebel authority means that even national actors, so state level actors, could be seen as external, very much not of the territory, in the same way that we may conceptualize international development actors or peace builders. It's also important to note that the FARC, these particular rebel groups, and in particular the FARC, in one of the cases that I'm examining in a current piece of work, are even evolving their way they're controlling transit points as a form of governance in order to sort of monitor and control the movement of populations, which also entails a specific engagement with local councils. So this authority is constantly dependent, right? It moves through its relationship with local institutions, with local councils, with local leadership, with civilian participation in different forms. And this, again, is crucial for access. So as I mentioned with the example from the engineer, this access of entry or development or humanitarian or peace building projects really depends hugely on local authority structures, institutions, and gatekeepers. So they can facilitate or block this access and therefore the success of these projects. Because as I mentioned earlier, peace building in sort of name only or in writing means very little if it cannot be implemented on the ground. So a lot of it's quite crucial to these outcomes to understand how access is managed and what makes it successful. So I use another example here, which I found very interesting for a research publication I had recently, which is actually within the risk assessment of a Colombian national energy provider. In this case, ISAGEN, Generadora Unión, and ISAGEN, when they were doing their environmental studies of a particular dam project in the department of Tolima. And part of their assessment on the success of this large-scale, in this case, large-scale development project, was about assessing who they needed to talk to and what they needed to do in order to secure this project. And part of it is, in somewhat oblique terms, understanding that there are principles of local participation with all the different actors involved in the processes in the region, and that it was important to engage in all of these actors in order to generate the adequate conditions to ensure that the project is carried out to the best possible terms. It highlights the need to carry out a work of consultation and sensitization of the project that involves the various social actors of the region, the ignorance of any party, which may be misunderstood and generate an inappropriate environment for the development of the project. So it's quite clear here, if perhaps somewhat ambiguous in its wording, that it is really crucial to not have any kind of sense of miscommunication, have clear channels of miscommunication with all the different actors in the territory. And in this case, in the Department of Tolima, in this particular area, it was also not just the social communities and the social local councils, but also the FARC. And that relationship with the FARC was also quite crucial. So we see here that when it comes to these development projects, which can sometimes be tied to peace building efforts, although I'll talk about peace building as a separate entity in a little bit, have to engage with local civilians to navigate complex environments. So it cannot be done without understanding that these civilians are themselves embedded in the local power structures, whatever these social processes. And these are, in many cases, and particularly in places like Colombia, shaped through the different participations in rebel governance. So, but we see this beyond Colombia. So we also see, for example, that in engaging in sort of projects and implementation of projects on the ground in Syria, there's a sense of constantly having to reshape relationships with really important points of contact in the civilian population. So in one case, a staff member of an NGO saying, I've had 5 or 10 incidents where I've got to the wrong people and had to go lower or higher than our normal point of contact in the sort of social hierarchies on the ground to resolve the issue. It also shows the vulnerability of these sort of relationships. So there's a necessity to understand who are the gatekeepers, who are the points of being able to actually facilitate the entry and the success of these projects. So again, with this project that I was looking at with these engineers, so one project, 2 road projects in Nariño, as I mentioned with the case of the engineer, and the dam project in Tolima, the community participation was playing a really central role in negotiating these access for these development actors and it has different sort of facets. So one, as I've been saying, is communicative. It's about explaining to those who are coming in, what may be the limitations or what may be the mobility that they have when they're implementing these projects. So in this case, in Nariño, this was a sense that there were unofficial rules. They would accompany us maybe for a while. Maybe they would tell us we couldn't work anymore. They would anticipate the risks. And in this case, this was an area where, again, there were quite a lot of criminal organizations rather than actual rebel governance organizations, but there was still the sense that the communities were navigating and negotiating this point of access. And in particular, in the communities in these areas, they were leadership within Consejos Comunitarios, which were Afro-Colombian institutions, and indigenous councils. But there can also be more direct intervention, and this goes back to this idea of how civilians participate in rebel governance. Project workers may also have to rely on civilians to actually step in and support what was being done against potential spoilers or other actors. So one local leader from a Consejo Comunitario mentions that at one point it was up to me to sit down with the paramilitary organizations. In this case, paramilitary is referring to a criminal organization with paramilitary predecessors. It says, you cannot tell us what to do. The project is ours. It's from our taxes. So there's a strong pressure from the community to say, we want this. That makes them be aware, and they have a conscience, and they ask for less money in this case because they were also trying to extort the project, because if not, the project's just abandoned there. There's also no opposition from the guerrillas because the communities come out. So again, there's a sense in which both of these actors, one of them more in our classic sense of rebel governance, and the other moving into more of the transitional period, where there is a responsiveness, there's a need to engage with communities in a specific way. And this actually is really important for the implementation of these projects. And in this case, this would be a project in the municipality of Barbacoas, which was a really crucial road project that had been fought for by the community for a very long time because of how difficult it was to access public health services, education services, and also markets in which to sell their goods. So this was seen as quite a crucial road in the steps towards development and potential for peace. However, it is crucial to note, and I'm happy to discuss this further, that civilians' ability to intervene and in fact put pressure on groups doesn't always have the same effect. And in many cases, this is actually more a condition of the uncertainty of control by these groups on the ground. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. I'll mention it again. But it is crucial to understand that this level of engagement and participation by civilians is limited under certain conditions. And that's also crucial for peace building, particularly if there are criminal actors that may spoil these processes. And that sense of condition is what I call tense coexistence in this research, which was, it's actually about where do these different actors not have a clear sense of control. Civilians are often more able and have greater opportunity in their participation or engagement with non-state armed groups and even state actors when neither of these two actors have a sort of clear sense of their position in the territory. This also pressures kind of both actors to some extent try to win over or gain the community's trust and support. So this again reshifts the relationship dynamics between these sort of authority structures and the communities around this idea of access. Armed groups can also use communities then to filter access for what they see as a sort of safer environment. So both of actors are then incentivized. Now, this also has significance for sort of more international actors and the sort of general, the broader processes of humanitarian development and peace building processes about how to enter and negotiate complex territory. So as I mentioned, there's a sense that local legitimacy is really important. Civilians tend to respond to aid projects in different ways. So even peace building projects or aid projects may not always have support from local communities or blanket support from local communities. So there may be variation in which elements of the civilian population is actually happy about a project that's been introduced. So they can range from sort of active opposition, toleration, or even promoting and acting on the project's behalf. But there's also sort of research that's been done on humanitarian engagement sort of with non-state armed groups and negotiating this access and sort of, again, sort of as I've been mentioning, like how to enter the territory. And a lot of it sort of does highlight, even though it doesn't explicitly tend to theorize around this idea, is that reputation is quite important. So militias that refuse access when the project is something communities want are sort of more susceptible to pushback from different sectors in the community, and sort of more susceptible potentially to losing support from crucial elements of the civilian population. So this is actually something that, again, is recognized by those project workers and how they go into the territory. It's also crucial, as I've mentioned, to understand that, again, sort of these rebel actors control, their sense of controlling territory is often nodal. So it's very much concentrated on transit points and access points. So as Schouten talks about, roadblock politics is this idea that this ability to actually spoil or intervene in the access of pretty crucial actors that are bringing in potentially peace building projects or crucial aid and humanitarian support is usually done around the armed actors' ability to spoil these entries. Now I want to connect this a little bit more to peace building. So literature on the rebel governance, again, talks a little bit more about the incentives of rebels groups to sort of allow interventions in rebel held areas. So this would be largely understood to be perhaps prior to a comprehensive peace accord, but it would be within the boundaries of potential development and peace building efforts. However, so far, despite some of the examples I've been providing, there's actually been very little that's been sort of studied comprehensively about civilian involvement and how this access is mediated. And it's also quite telling that much of the rebel governance literature, which really looks a lot about kind of during conflict and wartime processes, how do rebels govern territory, how do they provide services, how do they engage civilian populations, how do they try to build legitimacy, are often not really reflected in peace-building paradigms. So what happens when these rebels are no longer present? A lot of external peace-building efforts must still navigate complex local social ordering, but that these were shaped by previous experiences of rebel governance. This may be as a sort of acute or the sharp end of the stick, as it were, where there are sort of replacement actors, where you have either criminal actors or potential reconfigured dissident actors who are attempting to exert a similar type of control. But it can also be about the legacies of the institutions established by these rebel governance, right? What is the role in Colombia in particular? What is the role of the Juntas Acciones Comunal, which in a lot of rebel-held territories became kind of the crucial communication point between rebels and civilians and rebels and external actors? So what is the role of these Juntas Acciones Comunales when these rebel groups are no longer there? So there's a gap between this wartime research with also practitioner experience. As much as there's some literature, quite limited, on the engagement of practitioners with sort of humanitarian efforts and non-state-owned groups, there's a lot less on the sort of governance structures of the groups and what that means for sort of implementing these projects, and in particular in peace building efforts. So capacity building, the provision of public goods and services, but also rebuilding sort of infrastructure and investment into the territories to help actually allow for opportunities for the communities there. So this gets us sort of this new project that I've been collaborating with some people about, the politics of access. And a lot of this comes from trying to understand how the social dynamics behind rebel governance can affect and impact post-conflict outcomes. This is sort of situated in understanding that there's an evolving global order. There are likely to be fewer and fewer comprehensive accords in the way we've seen in Colombia that try to address at a sort of national and even international level all elements of the conflict. This isn't just being pessimistic, it's sort of a reflection of potential trends, but it is likely to see a lot of more ad hoc work by a variety of actors with fewer top-down assurances that are still charged with implementing projects on the ground. And again, in areas that are likely to have perhaps complex, unclear, or non-state authority structures that require engagement with. So the idea of this project, the impact is to sort of strengthen the peace-oriented interventions and how they gain access and succeed in conflict-affected territories, particularly in understanding the legacies of rebel governance and civilian participation. So some of the partners in this ongoing project that we were looking to consolidate are Dr. José Gutiérrez at the University of York, along with Professor Nina Kaspersen, Adrian Florea, Josephine Lechart, and Hyung-Jung Park. So, you know, some of the ideas we have is based on a lot of the sort of shared interest and research we have on rebel governance, but also on trying to bring some of this sort of wartime research a little bit more into the relevance of the peace building space. So some of the key questions here, the proposal basically is to examine the conditions that structure the negotiations between internal and external actors involved in peace and development. The first question is, how does this legacy of rebel governance shape the trajectory of peace building and the access of peace building actors? And the second is, what is the role of civilian participation after the demobilization of rebels in negotiating this access? So here we have actually the assumption that the rebel group, the insurgent actor, the political insurgent actor has largely withdrawn from the territory. It doesn't mean, of course, that they haven't been replaced or there's been an attempt to replace them by potentially other groups. But the question is then, how are civilians involved, and how does their participation now shape their responses to peace-building efforts afterwards? So what I want to focus for the last section of my talk is the theorizing of civilian participation, and in particular, how to think through this sort of theorizing in terms of how we could potentially assess its impact, its connection to and its impact on peace-building efforts in a sort of post-accord or post-transition period. Civilian participation in rebel governance, there's been some theorizing that's been done already. A lot of the research does focus more on the kind of incentives, motivations, and sort of limitations by rebels on rebel governance. But there's been a largely sense that rebel governance is sort of participatory or non-participatory in how it engages with civilian populations. And sort of Mampilli talks a little bit about this as like rebel leaders can choose this variety of approaches in how they engage with civilians, sort of unilateral approaches, or actually more like incorporation of civilians into the decision-making process. He also talks about this idea of sort of feedback mechanisms. So what I mentioned earlier is this idea that there's sort of channels of communication and relationships to civilian administration of certain public goods and services rather than just have rebel administration of that. There's also the sense of how are civilian institutions sort of integrated or involved, or they relate to rebel governance. So whether they are pre-existing institutions or they're sort of institutions that form in parallel and in response to rebel governance. But so as I mentioned, most of this focus, as it were, is on the supply side, which is to say why and how and where do rebels provide governance, and a bit less on the demand side. So where and how and why do civilians engage with this governance? What are their expectations? What are their involvement? Sort of what is their role in this? And particularly, there's no clear framework for unpacking this complexity, and there's no clear sense of how we can connect this and its implications for peace and peace building. So what I'm going to now discuss a little bit is the variation in the civilian participation in rebel governance and how we could potentially theorize it. And I'm doing so with a typology, because academics love typologies. And some of this is very early draft, so I'm actually very happy to discuss this in more detail and open this up to questions or to think a little bit more through how this can relate to ideas of assessment. But part of this idea of typology is that it provides us another way of, in a sense, measuring or organizing the knowledge we have about sort of the conflict environments, the social processes, and the sort of implications and legacies it has in peace building. So this typology of participation, I talked through a couple of what could be presented as sort of binaries, but are more likely to operate an extent to a spectrum. But this demonstrates also the complexity of rebel governance and its engagement with civilian population. So the first one is just this idea that rebel governance can either function as a hybrid or a parallel type of administration. So in this case, does civilian participation mean that civilians turn to rebel organized institutions, so courts, for example, as the Taliban tended to organize in Afghanistan? Or do armed actors enforce civilian institutions? So is it that we have traditional authorities or local leadership structures that will actually, make policy, as it were, or make decisions, and the armed groups enforce this? There's a sense in which rebel governance the participation can be inclusive or exclusive. So do all civilians within a specific territory have the same right to participate in rebel governance, or is it limited formally and informally to specific groups? So do specific groups have a bit more access and sort of relationship to these types of non-state authority structures? There's also the sense, and this maybe links a little bit more directly to the participatory versus non-participatory definition that Mampilli puts forward, but is it that civilians make decisions alongside rebel actors? Or do they simply invoke rebel authority to resolve issues, right? So do they simply make demands of existing rebel organizations? So it's about the integration of these decision-making processes. There's also a sense in which rebel governance, which sometimes can be conflated or compared to state governance, is actually a lot less established in many cases. So is this participation also formalized? Is there kind of a standing committee or institutional structure that can help coordinate these sort of relationships and communication? Or does it sort of emerge a little bit more in response to particular circumstances? Is it about the activation of relationships in a more informal or ad hoc way, or is it about sort of formalizing, institutionalizing this? And the final one is that whether this sort of participation is transformative or does it reify? And by this, I mean, does the participation of civilians in rebel structures sort of strengthen existing power structures, and in particular sort of maybe elite positions within a society? Or does it actually sort of produce new orders or hierarchies, right? Are new actors kind of given some primacy and that can disrupt social ordering within a territory? Now, the idea of this variation is that it helps us really think a bit more critically about what participation means. So what does it mean when civilians participate in this sort of rebel governance? And again, what does that then mean for their sort of agency and action after the withdrawal of these rebel groups? This idea that participation is a bit of a complicated assessment because it's not quite perhaps always best seen as agency. These are conditions, these are complex environments in which coercion is usually always a feature. And so there's a question to an extent as to how much that coercion really features in participation. Although it should be noted that governance always implicitly carries a capacity for coercion of civilian populations. So in a way, we may be borrowing from Migdal in understanding that participation is actually kind of a midpoint of assessment of social ordering processes, which moves from more sort of coercive to legitimation. So this idea that it's a repeated use and action, and Migdal is speaking in this case about the state, within these sort of institutions, political institutions. And this is somewhere between compliance and legitimation. So there's this question of, and I'm happy to talk more about it if that's something to consider in terms of measurement. But there's this point of engagement and relationship established between civilians and rebel actors within the processes of governance. And it's not necessarily also about, this is quite crucial, I think, also for the post sort of conflict environment, that civilian participation is not always pro-peace. And this is something sort of Roddy and I have talked a lot about. Civilian participation can also be about encouraging rebel or armed group violence or violent action. And this is something also that I've worked on in a publication with Jose Gutierrez, looking at how civilians can sometimes even pressure governance actors, rebel actors, to take sort of more punitive measures than they might have otherwise wanted to. So to think a bit about this transition period. This typology is to help locate the variation of civilian participation, to understand where meaningful and sort of multilateral linkages can occur between individuals, collectives, and institutions. And so this has implications, obviously, for civilian participation in peace building. Because after the rebel group is no longer present as a rebel authority, what does remain? What is sort of the social ordering that occurs when more and more of these peace building efforts and projects are going to be introduced into territories? So briefly sort of theorize a couple of mechanisms of how this participation may impact on this outcome, on this sort of peace building space. The first one is the coercion and enforcement. So a lot of these elements of participation are about how civilians engage with rebel actors as enforcers. So what is the nature of this dynamic, right? Is it again that civilians merely have rebel groups sort of impose a degree of enforcement of their norms, or do civilians actually make demands of rebel groups to enforce their norms? And so once this has happened, who takes up this space? Is this space taken up by the state? Is it taken up by other non-state armed groups? How does that civilian participation feed into that, right? How do civilians, as I mentioned at the beginning, sort of engage with these actors as security providers? These institutions, this degree of participation is also about structuring institutions. But, so as I mentioned with the Juntas de Acción Comunal, the local councils in Colombia, within civilian participation, there's always a sense that there's some spaces of coordination and communication. So what is the nature of that space or of those relationships? Are these, again, more networks, informal networks? Are there actual institutions that are established? Do these persist? Do these continue? Do they still have power? What is their relationship to other members or segments of the civilian population? And then finally, in relation, there's this idea that civilian participation is about who has voice and power in these spaces. So whose role or voice was given priority in participation in rebel governance, and what are these hierarchies persist, right? Because again, the community is not a homogeneous actor. Rebel governance tends to sort of, it can either, again, support elites, it can also sort of challenge elite authority and create new actors with power in the territory. In particular, this can be also considered in terms of illicit economies, and how sort of rebel governance can sometimes also help solidify the presence and authority of those involved in illicit economies. So what does this mean? So going back again to the practitioner's perspective. So a lot of these actors recognize that they must operate in complex and often quite dynamic environments. So understanding the lay of the land in this sort of local ordering is not only about the designing of successful outcomes for projects, but also about the daily encounters with different actors. So in Nariño, the engineer also discussed how it was really crucial when bringing in sort of external actors and external contractors, where there could have been sort of potential issues of corruption, or there may have been tensions with the president of the Junta Acción Comunal and the mayors. They have to be constantly renegotiated because these relationships are quite crucial for the access of the project at the time. So this idea is that local acceptance of peace building efforts of these new projects isn't merely about the legitimacy of these projects. It's not just a normative aspiration for what these projects are meant to achieve, but also a strategic necessity for their implementation. Because again, being able to understand and respond to the very particular dynamics within the social ordering and the legacies that rebel governance may have left behind, and how civilians are going to engage with these projects, is really crucial to be able to implement them. So in this project, we are collaborating with partners in International Alert and Conciliation Resources to develop case study approaches that will integrate these sort of practitioner priorities with this research of rebel governance and civilian participation. And as I mentioned, again, these are very complex security landscapes. So in many cases, in ideal circumstances, perhaps the non-state armed groups have withdrawn entirely and been replaced by a trusted and legitimate state military or other sort of security actors. As I think many of those who work in this field know, that is often not the case, and there's quite a lot of complexity around even the introduction of peacekeeping forces and sort of their relationship with civilians. So the aftermath of conflict often lead to armed groups reorganizing, in particular around criminal objectives. And while there is some research that's done on civilian participation in criminal governance, it's also still a little bit understudied, and in particular not in relationship to the legacies of conflict and its relationship to rebel ordering. So a lot of the research on participation and sort of engagement with criminal governance is studied in sort of urban areas and not necessarily areas that have a sort of direct legacy of conflict. However, there is a little bit of research that's been done on the sort of relationships between these sort of new criminal actors and how that might relate to civilian participation and therefore to sort of peace building efforts. So in Northern Ireland and Colombia, we can see again, as I've mentioned, that these sort of new criminal actors often adopt a lot of the language, the symbolism, and even in some cases the sort of structure of rebel organization and rebel governance to address civilian expectations. And in sort of Brazil, even in areas where we haven't seen sort of overt political conflict, we can see that in this case, the Comando Vermelho, they adopted collectivist techniques when imprisoned alongside Cold War leftists who were engaged in sort of minor sort of guerrilla warfare or social activism. So there's this sort of, again, this learning sense in which some of these techniques and some of these approaches to engaging with civilian populations are actually borrowed or inherited from rebel governance or more insurgent political approaches. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of like measurement within these contexts. So as I've been discussing a little bit, there are sort of some implications for how we can think about participation, how we can think about the post-conflict environment, and how we can think about politics of access. So in this case, the first idea is, how do we understand or how do we measure peace as sort of forms and manifestations of access? So again, peace often requires a sort of patchwork of both national agreements potentially, but also local arrangements, truce and negotiated access for aid and development. So assessing peace often requires measuring the degree of well-being according to the access that civilian populations have to food, to healthcare, education, to freedom of movement. So some of these are potentially in line. Humanitarian access allows for the number and safety of routes for aid delivery, for example. patterns of its access and conditioning. There's this idea of how well our service provision in these areas. Can people move in these areas without fear? But again, going back, assessing sort of civilian participation in these orderings. In this case, again, it's sort of seen as strategic. There's a potential sense in this metric or measurement could be seen as a way for practitioners to better evolve their understanding of how they're working in a territory, and that responds to sort of operational guidance for the effective management. And in this case, Gardner and Haver talk about the effective management of intermediaries used in direct negotiation for humanitarian access. And I think, as we all know, particularly in the peace building literature and with the local turn, the importance of community involvement, engagement, and acceptance, that we obviously need to understand civilians as more than intermediaries, but rather as sort of direct and quite important actors within this space. But again, this participation, as I mentioned, is often very much a product of the sort of contextual, sort of localized ordering. So if civilians actively participate in governance, even amidst conflict, then in peace building efforts sort of need to recognize and engage with the persistence and the evolution of these civic spaces and political voice. So beyond measurement of, say, state institutions or bureaucracies, how and where do civilians engage in the process of governance and peace building? And again, this is where we can think back to those potential mechanisms. So enforcement, do governing actors in this sort of post-conflict space respond their coercive power and behavior to civilian feedback within these sort of spaces? Does that engage better civilian communication? Are there channels, networks, or institutions where civilians can then affect these policies or where they enact change? And this again can be connected to the politics of access and how different projects can be assessed or responded to or accepted by civilians. And then again, and this is sort of trying to disaggregate again the sort of nature and role of civilian engagement, is that not all civilians are going to have the same responses or the same ability to, say, either negotiate actions or to facilitate or deny how projects are managed. And so again, what is the distribution of power in civilian participation around peace building efforts? So I'm going to finish up quickly. Obviously, as both Terry and Roddy mentioned, there are broader questions here about metrics and assessment, about measuring peace. But, I'm also curious a little bit about what you think about the typology. Some limitations is that it's largely agnostic to the motivations or causes for civilian participation. So I'm happy to discuss it. And it does exclude the relationship between rebel groups and the state. But broadly, does this capture the variety of civilian participation with rebel governance? So the key questions that I would personally have, just in terms of this project, but obviously there's a broader conversation, is, how can we theorize the civilian participation in rebel governance? And is civilian participation exaggerated, right? When we think of the role of civilians in these spaces, like, do we overestimate how much power or authority they have? Because that would have significant implications for a post-demobilization space. And again, do these mechanisms capture how this degree of participation and involvement might shape post-conflict peace building? Do we again, exaggerate the implications of civilian participation during conflict and wartime processes when there has been a transformation or a disruption and the establishment of sort of new ordering processes? And then broadly, because people come with very different experiences and backgrounds, I'm curious if you have cases or experiences of civilian participation and so the politics of access and the legacies of rebel governance that either captures or challenges potentially some of the ideas that I've presented here. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand it back over to you. Let me just stop sharing.
Fantastic. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Clara, thank you so much for what has been an incredibly rich and insightful and very nuanced talk. Really kind of pushing us to think about the complexities shaping a whole range of really core issues, right? So the factors that shape civilian capacity to navigate violent geographies, to negotiate with armed groups, to intervene if and when possible, right, with wider frameworks of development processes on the one hand. And also you've spoken to us a lot about how civilians, on the one hand, negotiate the politics of access, but also how the politics of rebel governance and, of course, its legacy shape daily life in the wake or in the aftermath of an accord. So you've spoken to us about research you've already been doing, and you've also given us a really extraordinary portfolio of future research, fascinating research looking at civilian participation in rebel governance. So I know that there are some questions out there. I had two questions that I wanted to put to you first while we kind of wait, hopefully, for some more questions to come in. So you spoke about how one of the metrics for peace, right, could be seen as a predictable, accessible, and legitimate authority in existence to meet the basic needs of civilians, right? And then you also spoke about how civilians have been, and I know from our work in Colombia, Lebanon, and Northern Ireland that this is very much the case, and you've done much more work since then, sort of developing this, right? But you also spoke about how civilians participate in the crafting of truces, right? In negotiating access, in building local arrangements. So I guess my question to you was, does it really matter who the authority is, right? If they're seen and perceived of as being legitimate, right, by local communities, if they're providing a degree of local services. We know very much in the context where we've been working, and I lived for 8 years in Guatemala and 5 in Colombia, and very much spent a lot of time in conflict affected areas. We know that the state is very much absent, right? So tell us a bit about what the factors are here. What would it really matter if the state were involved, if the Comuneros del Sur were involved, if the ELM were involved in acting as that authority? What's your thinking behind that?
That's a great question. I think it goes also to the thorny question that I was sort of touched on at the end about even defining civilian participation, and that sort of that framework that Migdal. So going back a bit to the classics and sort of state and society, but this idea of that there's a space between kind of pure compliance, in which case people sort of are subjected to a coercive and violent authority, and legitimation, which is kind of the aspirational goal. And I think part of it sometimes, I mean, there are nuances, and I think there are very clear ways in which these spaces are different, and we cannot simply compare them. But I think sometimes we do need to step back, and when we think of legitimacy, when we think in peace and conflict, we often have this sense that legitimacy means something like the state, when the state in most cases rarely fulfills the conditions of legitimacy. So I very much think that you've touched on that that complexity. I think when it comes to sort of, does it matter? I mean, this is also touching on some of the work that I was doing with Jose on the kind of the expectations of civilians in the kind of post-conflict space. And a lot of that is, there is recognition, and what I mentioned is there's recognition that some of these violent armed groups have victimized these communities, right? That they're in possession of this ability to exact coercive control in a way that is not what communities want, right? However, as you mentioned, it's also the same experience of many communities that the state is also responsible for this victimization. So I think what's actually been quite clear in these post-conflict spaces, and I'm sure those of us who've worked in or lived, as you say, in these spaces, that civilians often have a clear sense of what they would like their governance to be like. And that is largely safe, responsive, and not sort of arbitrarily violent, right? So there is a sense of what they would like governance to look like. And I think there's a sense that ideally the state should be that. However, in this really gray area that emerges after the signing of a peace accord, the state does not sort of magically transform into that overnight. And so I think there's this pragmatism in that participation and in that engagement. I also think there is a lot of variety, and that's why I wanted to touch a little bit on this sort of variation of political participation, because one of the crucial ones is that so it can vary, as it were, over cases. So in some cases, for example, if we look at the IRA in Northern Ireland, we may see that large sectors of the civilian population and the Catholic population actually fully support or endorse that these actors represent the community, that they are behind these lads, they're behind, the men behind the wire, as it were, right? But so there may be that sense of support. Whereas if we go somewhere, different cases, either in Colombia, we could go to cases in South Sudan. We could go to places where we see civilians saying, well, we don't like these actors. But we could also see variation within cases, right? We can see variation in cases where some members of the community may be very for the forms of action that are taken, and some may feel particularly prejudiced or stigmatized or isolated or afraid, right? Uncertain about it. So there's a lot of variation about how civilians themselves respond and participate. I think that's also crucial. But the most important thing, and I think, again, you touch on this, at the point of actual building peace, the realities of those metrics have to reflect that civilians are engaging in the most pragmatic constellation of participation they can, right? And that looks different usually in every case, and it rarely looks like what we would like the state to look like. So whether or not it's officially a non-state armed group or a rebel group, or if it's a sort of criminal group, or even, again, and there are spaces after the demobilization of rebels in which there aren't armed actors on the floor, but that much of this peace-building effort may be sort of driven by civilian institutions that were very much shaped during the conflict. And so there's an important, I think, incentive to recognize what those institutions are, how the conflict has shaped those institutions, that civilian participation, and how to engage with them.
Tremendous. Yeah, you drew on so many really key issues there. I guess I wanted just a really quick follow-up before I go to the other question that's very much responding to what you just said. And I know it's also something that you and I have spoken a great deal about in the past. You're using the term legacy, right? And I think that will also be part of the future project. So I wanted to ask a little bit about how you define it and what it seems to mean. You know that I have real trouble with the term legacy, and it's not that I don't think that there are phenomena that aren't legacy, because they clearly are, right? My difficulty has always been with, and I know you're not doing this, but with commentators and policymakers and practitioners and scholars who kind of define everything that happens in the wake of an agreement as legacy, right? And we know it's not. We know, and you spoke, well, we've spoken very much about this with respect to kind of a continuity, a spectrum between sort of legacy, continuity. We spoke about nostalgia when we worked on our project in the past. So how are you defining legacy? How is this different from any other potential definition that we might give to the phenomena that you're looking at?
Yeah, that's such a good question, actually. I didn't come into this thinking, theorize legacy. But no, it's a very good question. And I think one of the crucial things there is actually, I do agree. So there's this overstatement. And I think that's one of the things that in this project and in the one we've been discussing, that's actually quite crucial to unpack, is how much of what is confronted in a peace building effort or in the post-conflict or post-accord actually traced back to specific wartime dynamics, right? And specific wartime dynamics that therefore have been transformed during this transition period. And how much it is something actually new. So, when we're thinking about this particular sense of civilian participation, rebel governance, and what that may mean for the politics of access, particularly in sort of peace building, is that how much of sort of social ordering emerges from the presence of these rebels that have then left, how much of it emerges sort of to the preconditions. So the rebel groups then come along and, the juntas, well, actually in the case of Colombia, it's a bit complex because the rebels were around for so long. But, in many cases, they may come across, there may be traditional authorities whose presence pre-exists that of the rebel groups. And they may be transformed or shaped to an extent by the relationship with rebels, but you need to sort of unpick then which elements of those dynamics actually then persist in the sort of post-conflict space, and which of those are older, as it were, or pre-existing. And then finally, again, it's that idea of, how much of this space is dictated actually by the nature of the accord, right? Not by the conflict processes, but by the nature of the accord and what that implies. So, there's also that intervening variable that then disrupts this idea of legacy and says, well, how much of these dynamics are driven by that? So, for example, in the case of the paper I was writing about civilians' expectations after the demobilization of the FARC, one of the crucial things that I was focused on that really came out, I think, from the work was that expectations were driven by two factors. And one of those was the sort of pre-accord experiences of rebel governance. But the other one was very much by the conditions set by the accord, which was one of where the FARC were demobilized, but there was a very uneven sort of introduction of state presence. And in fact, when the state presence in sort of 2018 and 2019 was reintroduced, it was quite often violent and in response to the illicit economies. So so that kind of civilian engagement participation that occurred in that kind of space was dictated in one part in reference to the memories, the nostalgia, sometimes potentially the nostalgia, because when things in your present start appearing increasingly uncertain or insecure, you may invoke a sense that in the past things were better, which also complicates our ability to assess. But so in that sense, I think we really need to be careful and understand what are the intervening variables and how to actually pick apart which aspects of wartime processes actually shape potential peace building.
Fantastic. Thank you. One last question, because I'm really interested in the Q&A, and I know Jose, I think, is or was in the audience, so we'd great also potentially to bring him in. You make a really great statement that comes out of I think your article with Annette Eidler, that all peace building is local, right? So I had the privilege recently to have been back in Nariño at the invitation of the Colombian Commissioner for Peace. As we know very well, there are peace talks still going on in the area with the Comuneros del Sur, and it was very much about engaging with that process a couple of weeks ago when I was there. And what I thought was really exciting, right, but also really troubling was, so this is a paz territorial, this is territorial peace building, right? This is a very locally focused process, driven very much by communities' perceptions, experiences, demands, interests, and so on and so forth. But of course, the limitations to whether or not this process actually happens, whether or not some of these armed groups are able actually to demobilize, reintegrate, and so on, that is very much contingent upon the national level, right? It's contingent upon whether or not marco jurídico, a legal framework is going to be passed by the legislature. It's contingent upon whether or not that gets through, and whether or not, therefore, there are security guarantees, right? Legal guarantees for maybe for partial amnesty, the issues that we all know very well. That's not a territorial issue. That's a national issue, right? So that, of course, is a concern clearly for any groups that are wanting to demobilize and looking at the fact that in 10 months' time, the current president ain't going to be there anymore, very likely. And who is going to be there is going to be very much against potential processes, or at least that's very much what people, I think, feel. But at the same time, the concern is also that with what's happening with Trump in the Caribbean, in Venezuela, likely in Colombia, that the likelihood of extradition is also very much rearing its head, right? So in a sense, you say that all peace building is local, and that kind of the response to that is actually all territorial peace is national and international. So can you talk us through a little bit of that quandary?
I thought
right?
that'd be a little
I know
bit
there's kind of been the notion of hybridity that Roger and colleagues spoke about before, but I think it goes beyond that. I think it's more complex than that, and I think it's a different perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. I knew when I was saying it, I was like, oh, this is going to be controversial. And I think actually, specifically, it's not about all peace building is local in that the local can create peace, right? But I do think what's sort of interesting when we look at this sort of national level decision making in politics, they're essential. Particularly as I mentioned in this sort of evolving global order, security assurances from the top are actually kind of essential. But one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about how to understand it, and I think it goes back to maybe these questions about measuring peace that I've been thinking a little bit about, is that even those national or international measures or approaches have to be present on the ground. So their significance and their value is only in relation really to whether or not they're manifested within the lives of people. And that is itself always local. So very much so, because, and this is again where this is crucial, the aftermath of the 2016 agreement, where was this understanding that there would be this sort of replacement of the FARC in the territory with the military and the police. It was there on paper, it was there in the accord, it was there in the discussion, it did not appear on the ground, right? So in terms of people's sort of daily lives, that did not appear. And I think that was the crucial element of how they then, civilians then respond to the emergence of new actors. With what you were saying, which is the assurances for the demobilized actors, they're very much obviously aware and conscious of what's going on at the national level, but their concern is their implementation. So in particular, with the re-immobilization of a lot of combatants, it was that there were technically assurances made about their security, but in practice, in their lives, those security assurances did not manifest. And then finally, if we're thinking, as we've talked as well about like illicit economies and the sort of, the role, illicit economies are very much a national and international, global dynamic. However, their importance and their value to the presence of armed actors is often about how people interact with them, again, in their locality. So it's very much transversal. But I think sometimes we get caught up, or potentially this is just my critique, but we get caught up potentially in the language and the decisions being made, as it were, nationally or internationally, when I think we need to also really assess whether or not the reality of these are ever meeting those people who have probably the most to say when it comes to reigniting, armed conflict to some extent, right? Particularly with remobilized actors and with things like illicit economies and participation.
Fantastic, Clara. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass back, Terry, I think to you, and I think you're going to field hopefully some Q&A with the audience. Great stuff.
So we probably have about 7 or 8 minutes left here. And I popped, if you're a visual learner, I popped the questions in the chat box for you, but I'll read them out loud for the audience as well so that they know what the questions are. So Thomas wondered, under rebel governance, what degree of influences do civilians have on the rebel group in terms of provision or goods and services? And then Mary asks, I'm curious about when you are doing field work and putting yourself in these situations, how do you navigate the space and find the balance between rebel governments and their legacy and the experience of civilians while trying to maintain boundaries and avoid over-involvement while trying to build peace? So those are the 2 questions. And if others in the audience have questions, please do put them in the Q&A function.
Thank you. 2 great questions. The first question I'll address to Thomas. So I think that in itself is kind of one of the complexities that I've been touching on a little bit in the discussion in the presentation. So rebel governance is not a sort of uniform process or dynamic, and neither is civilian participation. So as I mentioned in this typology, there's a lot of variation in how civilians may be engaging with rebel governance. So in some cases, it may actually be at the initiative of rebel groups to open up spaces for civilians to make requests or demands, or to sort of dictate the nature of rebel governance provision. It's also within the initiative and often the control of rebel groups about how much they're willing to provide in rebel governance. And one of the sort of interesting findings that has been sort of researched a lot more recently is that rebel governance may be limited in providing goods and services, not out of the ideology or the sort of nature of the group, but rather its capacity. Because obviously rebel groups, their initial motivation is often that of a military force. So extending a lot of their remit into the provision, say, of goods and services puts pressure on their resources, puts pressure on their capacity. So sometimes the limitations in response to civilians has nothing to do with, the rebel group's position on the idea of providing goods and services or its authoritarian or non-authoritarian nature, but rather whether or not they're capable of it. And I think that also links quite importantly to why sort of civilian participation in rebel governance is actually quite ubiquitous. So even when we may see rebel groups act quite authoritatively or violently, there is usually always some degree in which civilians are incorporated or engaging with or participating within the governance, and largely because of the lack of capacity. I think it's then also important to think about conditions, sort of like at what periods of time and what factors may influence the ability of civilians to ask questions, to make demands or ask requests. As I mentioned in sort of the paper Negotiating Access, civilians can try to intervene regarding what they would like to see done in terms of provision of services, but the response may actually be more dictated by whether or not the rebel group thinks it really needs civilian support at that point. So if the rebel group is actually being increasingly pressured by state forces, they may actually be more responsive to civilian demands because they want to foster a better relationship. Whereas when they have a more unilateral control of territory, they may be less inclined under those conditions. And then finally, some of the work that's been done, particularly around Rubin and collective civilian institutions, is that civilians, the nature of the civilian sort of organization themselves is really important. So Rubin finds that that rebels actually benefit in terms of their governance when civilians are sufficiently organized that they can take over a lot of the governance factors. And so they may want actually strong civilian organizations who can manage things like justice, adjudication, or provision of services, provision of like road construction. However, the catch is that those kind of strong civilian institutions and collective organizations are also more capable of putting pressure on the rebel organizations and groups. So then rebels are then sort of more often challenged by these civilian institutions than they would by less organized or less institutionalized civilian groups. So there's a lot of variation on where and how and when civilians are more capable of influencing rebel groups in the provision of goods and services. And so into the second question on fieldwork. So this is always a fascinating sort of topic in a way, but I think the first thing is obviously there's a degree of humility when you go in the acknowledgement that what your work you're doing and the research you're doing has a sort of limited capacity in the moment to build peace. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with better understanding and learning and communicating with the people on the ground and what their experiences are and how that, how they are transforming it and how best, other institutions and actors are placed to support that. In a lot of these cases, I think one of the crucial elements is to enter this without value judgments. Because again, of course, rebel governance, I think increasingly there's a lot more nuance that's been done in the research, and people acknowledge, as we were saying with Roddy, that these aren't sort of going in assuming these are punitive or merely sort of violent actors that need to sort of be removed from the territory. There's a lot more nuance in these spaces. So a lot of it is going in very much trying to understand how these actors are understood and related to and viewed, rather than trying to attach value judgments to any of these relationships. And I think in part this is about ensuring that civilians, when they're trying to share the reality of the social ordering and the implications for peace building in the territory, aren't afraid to explain or explain about their history or their relationship with rebel actors, because obviously, particularly in areas, so in Colombia not so much, but in areas like Afghanistan, or in areas where there are prescribed groups, so groups prescribed at international level, there's a lot more reticence about explaining or communicating what may have been the reality of the social ordering. So I think a lot of it is trying to make sure that you're navigating the space by demonstrating no specific value judgment on what those orders may be.
All right, we might be able to squeeze in half of this next question that I'm inputting, and this comes from Julia and Helen. How did the contestations within rebel groups affect peace building? And what does it look like to design institutions that incorporate the priorities of different stakeholders? You probably can only answer one of those because we only have a couple. I'll let you choose.
Yeah. So contestation within rebel groups, I think it sort of depends on whether we're talking about the contestation, as Roddy was saying, is like a matter of legacy, and whether there was this, if that shapes the kind of aftermath of their withdrawal, or if we're talking about the fact that contestation means that in the aftermath there's actually still the presence of rebel groups. So in a paper I'm currently writing, there's, I think, a lot of the spaces in peace building need to acknowledge that even when there is a demobilization of a rebel group, there are often splinter or dissident factions that continue operating. And while sometimes they may operate more as, say, criminal organizations, they, again, as we sort of mentioned, they may actually carry with them the persistence of kind of relationships with civilians. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting, and for example, in Colombia in the aftermath, is that there are rebel groups that sort of never demobilized in some cases, and who reject or sort of challenge, or sometimes even were hostile to the rebel groups that did. And so that itself then creates tension within the peace building sector, particularly, say, if former, if demobilized combatants are integrated into the peace building efforts on the ground, where there are dissident or splinter factions that are antagonistic to the decisions that were made in that demobilization. So I think that's something also to be quite, and civilians are often also in the middle of that, and they may, I mean, in Northern Ireland as well, they may then decide that actually they are also hostile, or at the very least they reject, you know, the legitimacy or the presence of combatants and actors that have demobilized versus those who they see as continuing the fight. So that contestation can actually be quite crucial for even civilian engagement. Do I have time? I think the second one might be a much bigger question, to be honest.
Yeah, I think we're good on that, but thank you so much. I wish we had a little bit more time, because having worked a lot with NGOs and INGOs, the conversations around do no harm, conflict sensitivity, the ethical practice and concerns of aid diversion, collusion with rebels, and criminal governance is really dicey for development actors and humanitarian actors. So I wish we would have had more time to probe into that, and what you have learned in your field work. But we have run out of time. And so to the audience, thank you so much for coming today. I hope you enjoyed Claire's sharing of her work. We'll upload the video on YouTube, so you'll have access to it in the future. So thank you, Clara, for sharing an amazing presentation. Your work is very, very exciting and so important in the work of building peace. Roddy, thank you also for joining us today and for moderating. And to those that are still in the audience, we will have a couple more this spring, and we will be sharing that information with you, and we hope you will enjoy us in the future. So with that, we wish you a good day, a good evening.